In the early spring of 1981, a quiet corner of the Sierra Nevada was about to become the scene of one of California's most haunting mysteries. It began in a place so small, you could drive through it in minutes. A cluster of aging cabins hidden between forested hills, once a cozy mountain getaway, now stood half empty, weathered, and forgotten. This was Keddie, California. A town that had slipped off the map long before tragedy found it. Before we begin, if you're drawn to real stories that hide beneath history's surface, hit subscribe so you don't miss any of our next videos detailing true crime cases. Before the world knew its name, before police tape and news crews arrived, Keddie was just another quiet stop along a forgotten railway line. And in one of those cabins, number 28, a family searching for peace had just moved in. The Sierra Nevadas rise like ancient walls between California's Central Valley and the desert plateaus beyond. They are stunning in daylight and suffocating at night. Endless pine forests. Long shadows. Roads that wind endlessly through the dark. Keddie sat in a narrow valley carved by time and timber. Decades earlier, it had been a logging resort town, drawing families to its crisp air and mountain trails. But by 1981, the resort was in decline. The cabins, once filled with vacationers, were being rented out year-round to working-class families trying to rebuild their lives. It was quiet here, not peaceful quiet, but heavy quiet. The kind that settles in deep, the kind that makes every footstep echo louder than it should. For those who came to Keddie, life was affordable, but it wasn't easy. The nearest grocery store was miles away. Neighbors came and went. And when the sun dipped behind the mountains, the forest swallowed the light whole. This isolation, the beauty and the emptiness, was both the town's charm and its curse. Down near the base of the valley sat a cluster of about 30 small cabins. One of them was number 28. Its walls were thin, its furniture simple, and its rent affordable. For the Sharp family, that cabin meant stability. Glenna Sue Sharp had moved here less than a year earlier. A mother of 5, she was determined to give her children a calmer life, something far from the instability she'd left behind in Connecticut. She'd packed what she could fit into her car, driven across the country, and landed in this remote California town hoping it might be a safe place to start again. Sue had friends in the area. A neighbor had mentioned that the Keddie cabins were open for long-term rent. It wasn't perfect, but it was affordable. And after years of struggle, that was enough. Cabin 28 became home, a modest 2-bedroom space where the family squeezed in close. The walls echoed with the sounds of laughter, music, and the clatter of kids running through hallways. Sue was known for being kind, determined, and protective of her children. She worked hard, balancing classes at the local community college with part-time jobs. She wasn't chasing comfort. She was chasing peace. But peace in Keddie was fragile. Around them, other cabins were occupied by families and drifters alike. The mix of residents gave the area a strange energy, part neighborhood, part transitory stop. Some found belonging. Others simply passed through. When the Sharps arrived in late 1980, the town didn't notice much. Families came and went from Keddie all the time. But Sue's story was one of quiet courage, starting over with almost nothing. She'd left behind a difficult past. Her marriage had fallen apart, and she wanted her children to grow up in a safer, more grounded place. The mountains seemed like the perfect reset button. Her kids, John, Sheila, Tina, Rick, and Greg, ranged from small children to teenagers. They adapted quickly, making friends, attending the local school, and helping their mother settle in. By early 1981, Cabin 28 was filled with signs of a life rebuilding. A radio on the counter, hand-me-down furniture, Polaroid photos pinned to the wall. Sue had created a home out of very little. But Keddie wasn't the kind of place that easily forgot its silence. The isolation was real, especially after dark. There were no city sounds to drown out the quiet. Just wind in the pines and the occasional train that rattled the valley awake before vanishing into the dark again. Sometimes the stillness felt like calm. Other times it felt like the world had turned its back on the place entirely. For Sue, the nights could stretch endlessly. She'd sit up studying or writing letters, the forest outside whispering against the windows. It wasn't fear, not yet, but the uneasy feeling that life out here was fragile. By spring, snowmelt had turned the dirt roads to mud. The kids were back in school, and Sue was getting comfortable in her classes. Life was steady, if quiet. But as days grew longer, unease began to settle in across the cabins. People talked about strangers passing through town, men looking for work, visitors who stayed a few days and vanished. Keddie sat near a major highway, and its remoteness meant anyone could arrive unnoticed and leave without a trace. For a single mother raising 5 children in a sparsely populated valley, the sense of vulnerability was impossible to ignore. The nearest sheriff's office was miles away. The phone lines were unreliable. If something went wrong, help wouldn't come quickly. Still, Sue believed in building a life here. She encouraged her children to stay close, to look out for each other. She'd grown used to doing things on her own. She didn't scare easily. But around Keddie, whispers began to spread, small-town talk about conflicts, unwanted guests, and late-night arguments overheard through cabin walls. Most brushed it off. Mountain life always came with its rough edges. No one realized how close danger was drawing, or how soon the fragile calm of Cabin 28 would shatter. In Keddie, California, peace didn't last long. April 11, 1981. It began as a calm Saturday night in Keddie, a small mountain town where shadows stretched long between the cabins and silence ruled after dark. Inside Cabin 28, the Sharp family was winding down from an ordinary day. But before sunrise, the peace of this quiet valley would be gone forever. And by morning, the cabin would hold one of California's most disturbing unsolved crimes. That night, the Sharp family's modest cabin glowed with the warmth of a weekend evening. Sue Sharp, the mother, was home with her youngest sons, Rick and Greg, and their friend, a boy named Justin, who was spending the night. Her teenage daughter Sheila was next door at a friend's house. Her oldest son, John, was out with his friend Dana Wingate, another local teen. They were expected home later. It was one of those slow mountain nights. The TV hummed. The air outside was cold enough that the windows fogged slightly. Sue had spent much of the day helping her kids with chores, chatting with a neighbor, and making dinner. There was no sign that anything was wrong. Around 9 p.m., the younger boys were ready for bed. Sue let them stay up a little longer, and Justin, excited to be spending the night, unrolled his sleeping bag on the floor. The house was filled with the small, ordinary sounds of family life, quiet conversation, laughter, a few creaks of the old wooden floor. Outside, the valley was nearly silent. The nearest neighbors were only a few steps away, but in Keddie, the forest and the mountains seemed to swallow sound whole. No one could have imagined what was coming. As the night wore on, the house began to quiet. Rick and Greg fell asleep quickly. Justin soon followed. At some point before midnight, John and Dana returned to Cabin 28. Whether they were dropped off or walked back is uncertain, but they made it home. That would be the last time anyone outside that cabin saw them alive. Exactly what happened next has been debated for decades. There were no direct witnesses, and what followed left behind only fragments, traces of violence and chaos that investigators would struggle to piece together. Sometime in the night, the silence broke. Morning came quietly. Cabin 28 looked unchanged from the outside, still, silent, unremarkable. Shortly after 7 a.m., Sheila Sharp returned home from her friend's house. She expected to find her family making breakfast, the boys already up watching cartoons. But as she stepped inside, something stopped her. The air was still. Too still. Then, what she saw next would stay with her forever. Inside the living room, signs of a violent struggle covered the space. Furniture overturned. Objects scattered. Her mother, Sue, her brother John, and his friend Dana, were no longer alive. In the back bedroom, Sheila found her 2 younger brothers, Rick and Greg, and their friend Justin. They were alive. Unharmed, but deeply shaken. They had slept through most of the night, unaware of what had happened just a few feet away. Sheila ran for help, her voice carrying across the quiet cabins. Within minutes, neighbors were at her side, trying to make sense of the scene. Calls were made to the local sheriff's department in Quincy, and before long, patrol cars began arriving in the valley. The discovery stunned everyone. Keddie was remote, quiet, nothing like this had ever happened there. As word spread, more residents gathered outside the cabin. The narrow dirt road filled with footsteps, whispered questions, and disbelief. Investigators began working quickly, but the scene was chaotic. There were no signs of forced entry, and yet the interior told a story of sudden, intense violence. Neighbors recalled hearing nothing unusual during the night. No screams, no breaking glass, no shouts for help. It was as if the forest had swallowed the noise, leaving only silence behind. What had happened inside cabin 28 during those lost hours remained a riddle from the start. By noon, news began to spread beyond Keddie. Reporters and deputies filled the valley, their cars lining the narrow road. Cameras captured images of investigators stepping carefully through the cabin door, their faces pale and stunned. The surviving children were taken to safety. For the rest of the town, fear settled in fast. Residents began locking their doors, checking over their shoulders, wondering if whoever had done this might still be nearby. Rumors began within hours, about strangers, about grudges, about unfinished business that had somehow reached cabin 28. The tragedy was more than just a crime, it tore through the illusion of safety in the mountains. No one could explain how something so brutal could happen without warning, without sound, and without anyone noticing. For investigators, it was the start of a long, tangled case. For the people of Keddie, it was the day their quiet town changed forever. The investigation that followed would uncover clues, fingerprints, strange footprints, missing weapons, and unanswered questions that seemed to multiply with every passing week. But from the very first morning, it was clear, this was no simple case. Who had entered cabin 28 that night? Why had the younger children been spared? And how could so much chaos unfold without a single neighbor hearing? In the aftermath of the Keddie murders, investigators believed they were on the trail of answers. But as hours turned to days, and days into weeks, those answers began to slip through their fingers. The deeper they looked, the more tangled the case became, missing evidence, conflicting reports, and suspects who seemed to vanish from scrutiny. What happened inside cabin 28 was horrifying. But what happened after might be just as unsettling. Morning turned to afternoon as investigators from Plumas County Sheriff's Department tried to process what they were seeing. 3 people gone. 3 children spared. No signs of forced entry. The first officers on the scene were unprepared for something of this scale. Keddie was a quiet, rural place. They'd handled bar fights and property disputes, not this. Deputies moved through the small cabin, collecting items they thought might be important: a bent knife, a bloody hammer mark, bits of tape, and a phone cord pulled from the wall. But even in those first hours, mistakes began to happen. Evidence wasn't properly logged. Some items weren't photographed before being removed. Outside the cabin, curious neighbors, and even reporters, wandered dangerously close to the scene. In the confusion, the integrity of the scene was lost. Later, crucial details would vanish completely, as if erased from the record. Over the next few days, investigators worked around the clock. They built timelines, listed potential suspects, and tried to reconstruct the hours before dawn. Sue Sharp was last seen alive late that evening. Her son John and his friend Dana had returned home shortly before midnight. Neighbors nearby heard nothing, no screams, no calls for help. Detectives believed the crime had been personal. The violence was targeted, not random. They theorized the perpetrator may have been someone Sue knew. Someone who could have entered the cabin without force. Within days, attention turned to 2 men who lived nearby, both acquaintances of the Sharp family. One of them was the father of young Justin, the boy who had been sleeping in the cabin that night. Investigators noted inconsistencies in their stories. Alibis didn't line up. But despite early suspicion, no arrests were made. Then came another setback. Several pieces of evidence were reported missing, including a knife that might have been crucial to the case. Months later, a hammer believed to match one from the cabin's missing tool set was found discarded near a nearby riverbed. But by then, too much time had passed. The trail was already cold. As weeks passed, the investigation began to buckle under pressure. Some officers pushed theories without evidence. Others ignored leads entirely. Witness statements were taken, lost, and later rewritten. Key reports disappeared, some never resurfaced. Rumors spread quickly that the department mishandled the case, or worse, tried to bury its mistakes. Theories of corruption began to circulate. Was it incompetence, or something darker? The sheriff's office insisted they were doing everything they could. But to many, their actions told a different story. One deputy claimed vital evidence was sent to the state crime lab, only for the lab to deny ever receiving it. Another officer mentioned hearing names that were later scrubbed from official reports. Every clue seemed to open another question, every lead ended in a dead end. And while investigators argued over procedure, the families waited, desperate for answers that never came. For the surviving children, the trauma of that night became an open wound, one complicated by years of silence and uncertainty. Despite the confusion, investigators kept circling back to two primary suspects. Both men were locals, both had connections to the Sharp family, and both gave statements that raised red flags. One of them, neighbors recalled, had a volatile temper. The other reportedly had a fixation on Sue. When questioned, their stories conflicted. Times didn't match, details shifted. According to reports, one suspect even claimed to have a dream about the crime, describing details that had not been made public. Despite this, investigators failed to act decisively. Why? Some pointed to lack of training. Others suspected influence or fear. The suspects were eventually questioned again, but inconsistently. Polygraphs were mentioned, but records of the results were never officially released. And just as quickly as their names appeared, they faded from the headlines, replaced by new theories and more confusion. By the end of 1981, the case had stalled completely. For the people of Keddie, frustration turned into distrust. How could so much evidence disappear? Why were potential witnesses never re-interviewed? And why did investigators seem so determined to move on? In time, talk of cover-ups began to overshadow the search for truth. Some believed the suspects had connections to law enforcement. Others thought local officials simply wanted the case to fade, to protect the image of their small mountain community. Whatever the reason, the result was the same: no arrests, no justice, no closure. And as years passed, the mistakes of those first few days would haunt the investigation forever. The investigation into the Keddie murders didn't end, it unraveled. Leads were forgotten. Witnesses were lost. But the story didn't stop in 1981. New information would emerge decades later, old files rediscovered, DNA retested, and long-buried confessions brought to light. But even then, the truth remained just out of reach. By the summer of 1981, Keddie was no longer just a quiet mountain town. It had become a rumor mill, a place where every whisper felt like evidence, and every face could hide a secret. When the investigation failed to deliver answers, the story didn't end. It only spread, through living rooms, across bar counters, and down empty forest roads. Everyone had a theory. And in Keddie, theories were all anyone had left. In the weeks after the murders, the small population of Keddie turned inward. People who once left doors unlocked now double-checked the locks twice each night. Strangers were eyed with suspicion. Neighbors stopped trusting each other. The sheriff's office said little, which left room for imagination, and imagination filled the silence fast. Some whispered that it had been revenge, a payback for something Sue Sharp knew but wouldn't reveal. Others spoke of a secret relationship, a personal betrayal that spiraled out of control. And then came darker ideas, that the case was being buried on purpose. Rumors outpaced facts, twisting the story until truth and fiction were impossible to separate. Each week, a new theory emerged. Each week, the fear deepened. One of the first theories to take hold was revenge. Sue was known for standing up for her family, for defending her children and others in the community. Some believed she may have challenged the wrong person, someone unstable, someone unwilling to let it go. Whispers claimed a dispute had taken place days before the tragedy, a personal confrontation involving a friend or acquaintance. No police report ever confirmed it, but in small towns, stories don't need paper trails to survive. Investigators followed leads connected to people Sue knew, some close, some distant, but without solid evidence, every theory dissolved into speculation. Still, the word revenge stayed pinned to the board, a motive without a name. The next theory centered on secrets, personal ones. Locals began to wonder if Sue had discovered something she wasn't supposed to know. Some suggested she'd uncovered private dealings among her neighbors, things better left alone. Others believed she'd been protecting someone, a friend, a child, maybe both, and that protection had consequences. Without confirmation, these stories took a life of their own. In coffee shops and on porches, people spoke quietly but urgently, each retelling changing small details. Every theory carried a hint of truth, and every hint seemed to grow into its own legend. By the fall of 1981, the question wasn't just, "Who did it?" It was, "What did they want to hide?" Then came the most controversial theory of all, that the case wasn't just unsolved, but intentionally kept that way. The sheriff's office faced growing criticism for its mistakes, evidence misplaced, interviews lost, suspects questioned and released without follow-up. Soon, whispers turned into accusations. Some locals believed certain names were off-limits, protected by friendship or influence. Others thought investigators knew more than they admitted. Was it incompetence, or something deliberate? Years later, former officials would defend their work, saying they did the best they could with what they had. But those explanations never erased the town's suspicions. Once the idea of a cover-up took hold, it never left. Over time, the unease deepened when more tragedies touched those connected to the original case. People linked to Keddie, whether witnesses, neighbors, or friends, met early deaths under uncertain circumstances. To residents, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like the story was swallowing its own witnesses. Every new loss reignited old theories. Was someone silencing the truth? Or were these simply cruel twists of fate magnified by fear? No proof ever surfaced, just patterns that seemed too haunting to ignore. Over the decades, three main theories endured. First, revenge, a personal vendetta carried out by someone close. Second, a crime of passion, fueled by jealousy or betrayal. And third, a cover-up, where the truth was known but buried. Each has its believers. Each has its contradictions. Even modern investigators and amateur sleuths revisiting the case with new technology can't agree. Every discovery raises new questions instead of answers. Evidence that could close the case seems always just out of reach, lost, misplaced, or degraded by time. The line between theory and truth has blurred so deeply that, 40 years later, they almost feel the same. What if the killer wasn't a stranger, but someone who shared dinners, conversations, or laughter with the Sharps? What if the truth was recorded in a missing report, sitting forgotten in an old box of files? What if, after all these years, the story was still being protected by silence? Time has dulled the noise but not the questions. The whispers never stopped. They only changed voices. Decades later, new detectives would reopen the case with modern tools. They'd uncover evidence that had been overlooked, lost, or ignored, and finally confront the past that Keddie could never escape. More than 40 years have passed since that night in Keddie. The cabin is gone, torn down decades ago, but the ground still feels heavy, as if it remembers. People thought time would bring answers. It didn't. Instead, it left behind something colder, silence, and a trail of evidence that refuses to fade away. In the years after the tragedy, the world moved on, but Keddie didn't. The old resort cabins were dismantled one by one, until only the foundations and memories remained. For a long time, the case was filed away, unsolved, unspoken, unfinished. But to those who lived it, especially the surviving Sharp children, it never stopped haunting them. Survivors carried both grief and determination. They wanted answers, not just for justice, but to finally understand why. The official file was thick, filled with fragments of a puzzle no one had solved. But as years turned into decades, a new generation of investigators decided to reopen the box that time tried to close. In the early 2000s, fresh eyes began looking at the Keddie case again. Plumas County investigators, using modern forensic tools, re-examined what little remained of the original evidence. Old notes were scanned. Forgotten reports resurfaced. And deep in the archives, new clues began to emerge. Among the rediscovered files were photographs, recordings, and a fragment of evidence that hinted the truth might still be traceable. DNA testing had advanced, and for the first time, science could look where human memory had failed. For decades, people believed the trail had gone cold. But cold cases don't disappear. They wait, for technology, for persistence, for someone who refuses to let them die. The renewed investigation didn't just revisit old suspects, it redefined them. One name stood out, a man once close to the Sharp family, long whispered about but never formally charged. Files revealed inconsistencies in his statements. There were clues suggesting he had been interviewed, and then inexplicably cleared. Tapes surfaced that had never been made public, conversations between suspects and acquaintances that hinted at guilt, or at least knowledge of what happened that night. The sheriff's office confirmed these recordings were real. It didn't prove everything. But it proved one thing clearly: parts of this story had been hidden, and not by accident. As forensic technology advanced, investigators tested items never examined in the original probe, including tape, wire, and potential biological traces found at the scene. While no public statement confirmed a match, sources close to the investigation hinted that results pointed strongly toward individuals already known to law enforcement in 1981. It was both a revelation and a frustration. If those names had been investigated properly 4 decades earlier, the case might have been solved long ago. Modern detectives faced a cruel reality. Technology could expose the truth, but not revive lost opportunities. Witnesses had passed away. Records were incomplete. And the walls of silence around the old case were still strong. For the surviving family, every new revelation was both painful and necessary. Each document, each rediscovered clue, reopened wounds, but also reopened hope. Sue Sharp's surviving children have spoken occasionally in interviews, reflecting on their mother's courage and resilience. To them, she isn't defined by what happened, but by the life she built before it. Friends and townspeople still visit the site each year. They leave flowers, notes, and small tokens, reminders that even forgotten stories deserve remembrance. In true crime history, many cases fade. This one never has, not because of its horror, but because of the questions it left behind. Despite decades of research, official statements, and renewed attention, the central question remains untouched. Who truly entered Cabin 28 that night? And why? Some believe it was an act of vengeance. Others point to jealousy, betrayal, or fear. A few think the real story was buried under small-town politics and human failure. Maybe the truth has been there all along, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to connect the final dots. Time has stolen witnesses, blurred memories, and changed the town itself. But some stories refuse to be buried. Keddie still holds its secrets, and every new generation finds itself drawn back to this mystery, trying to answer the question that still echoes through the pines. The cabin is gone, but its shadow remains. And until that final answer is known, the story of the Sharp family will never truly rest. Who killed the Sharps? This was the story of the Keddie cabin murders, a tragedy, a mystery, and a decades-long search for truth. If you've followed this journey and want to explore more stories like this, real cases, hidden histories, and unresolved puzzles, make sure to subscribe to this channel to join our community, and be the first to uncover the next story waiting in the shadows.